Good afternoon and welcome to our 5th program of SNED Talks. How many have been before to SNED Talks? Wow, that's really cool. We always like to point out, by the way, that Isabel Lumsden Couch is here in spirit. She was one of the founding members of this organization and just the consummate educator, so we always like to invoke Isabel's memory. I'm Priscilla Wilson, and I'm the one member of our Adult Ed Committee who's willing to stand up here and be the MC. But would like to, I started out being the chairperson, but it's such a great committee that we don't really need a chair anymore. The other people whom I would like to recognize are Ann Gillespie, Tony Reed, and Barbara Williams. I know I do this every time, but I can't help it. It's just the most incredible committee ever. We just really are a mutual admiration society, I guess. Okay, so there are other people we would like to thank. Lynda Harding, our tech guru, who takes care of lighting, sound, and the visuals. Actually, I could do a SNED talk about Lynda Harding. Would that be okay, Lynda?
Boring.
Thing is, then I'd be giving a SNED talk about a lot of other people too. Sam Williams, who designed our logo, and yeah, there it is, our very cool logo, and who does the layout and design on all of our materials. Let's see, Roger Williams, our videographer, who
thanks, Mom.
Who is his web identity is SauteeLive.com, and he does a great job for us. Encouraged us to do this from the start, and you can find any of the SNED Talk programs on YouTube.com. Just do SNED Talks. Type in SNED Talks. Who else do we want to thank? Dee Dee Vogt for all the support she gives us from the staff at the center. Janice Limburner, our smiling money taker. Thank you, Janice. I never have thanked her before, but she deserves to be thanked. Our theme for today is Nurturing Heart, Mind, and Planet. We have 3 wonderful speakers, each of whom will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll allow some time for questions. Afterward, we will have refreshments in the Crittenden room next door, and that will be a chance when you can ask more questions and meet the speakers. A few housekeeping things. Restrooms are at each end of the hall. I know there are some people here who haven't been here before. The ladies' restroom is to my left, that end of the hall, and men's to the right. There's an exit on the side and exits in the back of the auditorium. We would like to ask you to turn off your cell phones if you have not already, and would also like to ask you not to take pictures. Anything I'm forgetting?
Yes.
What?
You'll be able to sign up for various things next door. So look to sign up for a list of poems and look.
Okay.
Haiku.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, when you're having refreshments next door, you'll see that there's some literature available and a place to sign up for Lynn Hopper's haiku email list. So, yeah, I'm doing that at the end. This is what happens when you ask for help, right? Okay, so the people that I haven't thanked who really deserve special thanks are the speakers themselves. I don't think anybody realizes when they get into this just how much work is involved. It's a tremendous amount of work. And we greatly appreciate y'all's contribution to adult education here at the center. So, first up is Lynn Hopper. Lynn is a poet. Her work has appeared in many publications, and recently for a year and a half now, her daily haiku emails have become a source of inspiration for many of us. Lynn grew up near the marshes of Glen, but has lived in Lumpkin County and been part of our wider community for many years. She's retired from a 30-year career in library leadership, and now she loves working part-time for Georgia Forest Watch. Lynn's SNED talk is entitled, Recover Your Love of Poetry.
Hello. Matilda, who told lies and was burned to death, by Hilaire Belloc. Matilda told such dreadful lies, it made one gasp and stretch one's eyes. Her aunt, who from her earliest youth had kept a strict regard for truth, attempted to believe Matilda. The effort very nearly killed her, and would have done so had not she discovered this infirmity. For once towards the close of day, Matilda, growing tired of play and finding she was left alone, went tiptoe to the telephone and summoned the immediate aid of London's noble fire brigade. Within an hour, the gallant band were pouring in on every hand, from Putney, Hackney, Downs, and Bow, with courage high and hearts aglow. They galloped roaring through the town. Matilda's house is burning down! Inspired by British cheers and loud proceedings from the frenzied crowd, they ran their ladders through a score of windows on the ballroom floor and took peculiar pains to souse the pictures up and down the house, until Matilda's aunt succeeded in showing them they were not needed, and even then she had to pay to get the men to go away. It happened that a few weeks later, her aunt was off to the theater to see that interesting play, The Second Mrs. Tanqueray. She had refused to take her niece to hear this entertaining piece, a deprivation just and wise to punish her for telling lies. That night, a fire did break out. You should have heard Matilda shout. You should have heard her scream and bawl and throw the window up and call to people passing on the street, the rapidly increasing heat encouraging her to obtain their confidence, but all in vain. For every time she shouted, "Fire!" they only answered, "Little liar." And therefore, when her aunt returned, Matilda and the house were burned. When I was about 5 years old, I memorized, just for fun, some of these clever and ghastly cautionary verses by Hilaire Belloc, all about the terrible things that could happen to children if they misbehaved. They had titles like Jim, who ran away from his nurse and was eaten by a lion, and Henry King, who chewed bits of string and was early cut off in dreadful agonies. Why did I memorize these? Or given the nature of the content, you might ask, why did your parents let you do that? Well, I'll tell you why I did it. Because they delighted me. I want you to do a little time travel now. Think back to your first experience with musical language. Nursery rhymes, skipping rope rhymes, first verses you heard or even memorized. I want you to just tell your neighbor one that you remember from early childhood.
You are old.
There it is! Your natural love for poetry. What happened to it? Tracy K. Smith, the current poet laureate of the U.S., says children live in metaphor and take readily to poems without any anxiety. But soon, she laments, they are forced to put that away. Now think back to 6th, 7th, 8th grade. How many of you wrote poetry when you fell in love for the first time? Why is everyone a poet in adolescence? We go through a time when we're overwhelmed by body and feelings, and we need a way to express that. Prose just doesn't work with such powerful feelings. We need a concentrated form for expression. Next, put yourself in high school. I think that's where most of us learned we are not smart enough to understand poetry. Let's look at a clip from Dead Poets Society.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not laying pipe, we're talking about poetry. How could you describe poetry like American Bandstand? Well, I like Byron, I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it. Now, I want you to rip out that page. Rip out the entire page. You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out! Go on. Rip it out! Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, not just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip! Be gone, J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. Rip! Shred! Tear! Rip it out! I want to hear nothing but ripping of Mr. Pritchard. We'll prepare it. Put it on a roll.
Oh, goodness. Tracy Smith says, students feel anxious about what they're being asked to do with the poem as though the poem is out to trick them. Let's look at it. We looked at the example. So what is poetry? Why should we care about it? And how do we fall in love with it again? One research study was published in the journal Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience. It demonstrated that poetry changes our brains. Researchers concluded that listening to poems activates parts of our brains that are not activated when listening to music or watching films. Apparently, the study says, there is something fundamental to the poetic form that implies, creates, and instills pleasure. And here's a poetic take on what poetry can do for us. It's a poem called The Lightest Touch by David White. Good poetry begins with the lightest touch, a breeze arriving from nowhere, a whispered healing arrival, a word in your ear, a settling into things. Then, like a hand in the dark, it arrests the whole body, steeling you for revelation. In the silence that follows a great line, you can feel Lazarus deep inside, even the laziest, most deathly afraid part of you lift up his hands and walk toward the light. Again, research shows that there is something fundamental to the poetic form that creates and instills pleasure. But what is that poetic form? Well, there are three important elements that contribute to a poem. Sensory images are one of the most important. From the White poem, the lightest touch. Do you feel that? Lightest touch, a hand in the dark. The second element is the sound of the words. For example, rhythm. Matilda told such dreadful lies. Rhyme. Emily Dickinson's tell all the truth but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. And also repetition of sound. Listen to Poe's The Raven, a passage from Poe's The Raven. The silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. The third element is figurative language or metaphor. You can feel Lazarus deep inside. Well, we don't really, do we? But we do. As Mary Oliver reads her poem, Wild Geese, see if you can pick out some of the images, the music, and the metaphor that she uses.
So this is Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Did you see yourself walking on your knees through the desert? I know you heard wild geese, but that doesn't really count because that was on the video. What music was in that poem? Listen to this repetition. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun. Meanwhile, the wild geese. What metaphor struck you? The clear pebbles of the rain, the world calling to you like the wild geese, the family of things. I'll close with this quote from the poet Dan Chilati. Read poetry because the political and environmental realities make you weep, and poetry can help. Poetry can help. Read poetry because it offers no answers, no advice, no cures, just understanding and love and timing. Read poetry because the world is more than the facts of the world. Read poetry because birds honeysuckle lit windows, new shoes, walking outside, donuts, lipstick, fresh peaches, cocktails, kisses in the rain produce in you a feeling that you never want to lose, but you will. And the only thing you can do is pay better attention when the feeling comes again. And here it comes, and there it goes. Was it as rich as it could be? Life is so short, my friends, but poetry makes it last a bit longer. It does. It is true. Listen. So we have time for just a few questions, if anybody has questions for me.
How long have you been interested in poetry?
Oh my goodness. Well, since I did those cautionary verses as a 5-year-old, you know, I mean, I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but that's when it started, I
Did
guess.
you ever lose it and then go back to it?
I went through an intense period in middle school, like a lot of us do, and I was fortunate enough to have a teacher who was willing to take poems that I wrote and critique them on her own time and give them back to me, you know, so that was such a gift, I can't tell you. But yeah, and then, I don't know, during early adulthood, busy with career and all that, but, you know, there was kind of a lull, and now I'm much more involved with it than I was then. Thanks. Yeah.
What do you write poetry on now?
That is a really good question. Because I never start a poem with a thought. Something comes, and then I look at it and say, what is that? And where does it want to go? So I would like to say, you know, I write socially environmental, you know, socially responsible poetry, or important poetry for the world and all that. But you know, I write from what my heart is telling me. That's how it works for me.
But
Yeah.
I would assume poetry would come from whatever is inside. If you're thinking politics, you're thinking environment.
Oh yeah.
Or you're sad.
Yeah, I mean, some of those themes do come out. I just don't start there. You know, that was my point. But yeah, I mean, my poems come from me. You know, they can't come from anybody else. So
It has to be what's going on.
what's going on? Yeah. But it's probably more heart than head. That's my point, I guess. Good questions. What else? Yeah.
Would you tell us some of your favorite poets?
You can actually pick up a list of them next door. Here's my commercial. There's a handout. Barbara was nice enough to make us a handout, and I called it an idiosyncratic list of poetry because it's just my favorite poets. They may not be yours, but you know, they're mine. Mary Oliver's right at the top of the list, I'll tell you. She's fabulous. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Anne.
I think a lot of people still, as adults, find poetry inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would encourage people to give it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not necessarily write it to start with, but you could. But there are poetry events sometimes, or just pick up a book. Now, if you just picked up a book, I love Billy Collins, for example. I think he's accessible for everybody.
Yes.
Absolutely everybody. Have you got any suggestions for a starter adult poet? Potentially poet.
That's what my list tells you.
Oh, okay.
It does. It has not only my favorite poets, the people that I like to read, but also some anthologies and things like Garrison Keillor's Good Poems you know, there's some anthologies that are really nice to and easy to get into, I think, for people who haven't dealt with poetry in a long time and learned in high school they weren't smart enough to understand it. So you are, trust me. Yes.
So how did you discover your favorite poets? Was it somebody giving you their list or
Yeah, I had some really good advice. At one point I went to a poetry workshop and the poet there, Kate Daniels, said, get an anthology, you know, see which ones speak to you. Just a general anthology of modern poetry, and that's on my list too. But see which poets, you know, are you drawn to, and then go check them out, you know, go check out their collections, and that was really good advice. So I would encourage just a lot of reading and see which ones you like. And if you don't like it, put it down. My goodness, life's too short.
I just wanted to plug Lynn's haiku. Every day we get one on our email, and it's wonderful. I think you would enjoy it. You can be on the list as well.
Thank you, Tina. That's been a real pleasure for me. It's just a practice, a daily practice. So some of them are better than others, you know, every day. But yeah, thank you. Okay, anything else? All right.
Next is Lynda Dawes. Lynda and her husband Ted have lived here in Sautee for 20 years. In fact, practically right around the corner. Lynda, a research psychologist by profession, is retired from the Centers for Disease Control, where she did research on HIV, AIDS, and violence. Now she stays busier than ever with gardening, quilting, the SNCA History Committee, and more other volunteer activities than we have time to name, I think. Lynda's talk is entitled, Things I've Learned About Life from My Garden.
I'll start by telling you that Lynn memorized poetry as a child and grew up to be a wonderful poet. I played with mud pies when I was a child and ended up being a gardener as an adult. Our distant ancestors were pioneers in this country. They farmed to survive, and some of them weren't so very happy about it. Our parents and grandparents fed their families from gardens during the Depression or from victory gardens during World War II. Some of them gardened to survive. Today, few of us garden to survive. We garden because we want organic produce or beautiful flowers. In fact, some people ask, why would we spend 40+ hours a week in a stressful work environment and then come home, get down in the dirt, and garden? Just why would we do that? So what I'm going to hope to do is to convince you that gardens, and on a larger scale, nature, can help each of us. Gardens can improve our physical, our cognitive, our mental, and even our social health. Even for those who don't like to or can't garden, just being outside has many health benefits. And that's not only true for kids, but for each of the adults here today. Let's start with the health benefits. I'm going to mention only 3. Gardening is an opportunity for moderately intense physical exercise. For those of you who don't know what Pilates is, it is a physical exercise regimen that is typically, although maybe not always, done in the gym. And I don't always dress like that when I garden. In fact, as my husband will tell you, I'm quite a dirty gardener. I truly get down in the dirt. So think about it. When you garden, you bend down, you carry heavy objects, you stretch to weed, and so on. Gardening can strengthen muscles, improve eye-hand coordination, and improve balance and coordination. It can make you more flexible and improve your physical stamina. And even if you don't actually work in the garden, just walking around in a garden or hiking in the woods is good physical exercise. Gardening can also help reduce vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D is produced by the body as a response to sun exposure. Vitamin D deficiency is associated with poor bone health, some cancers, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disorders, and other health conditions. A recent study published by the National Institutes of Health found that gardening and regular cycling reduce vitamin D deficiency in older adults. Interestingly, brisk walking did not. I suspect the reason for that is because I know when I walk, if I have a choice, I go in the shade. Think about it. So another benefit of gardening is exposure to soil that contains a beneficial bacteria called Mycobacterium vacci. Scientists now believe that exposure to these bacteria during childhood may protect us from allergies and autoimmune disorders as adults. Other scientists have proposed that exposure to these bacteria may reduce the amount of depression in adults by increasing the level of serotonin in our brains. So let's talk about cognitive benefits of gardening. Will gardening or being outdoors make us think better or be smarter? Well, I don't know about smarter, but I think it will help us think better. There is a lot of concern these days about the amount of time we spend on technology. Think about it. Many of us may be texting, reading emails, looking at Facebook, reading various news channels all at the same time. Now, nobody in this room does that, right? So too much distraction like that can increase mental fatigue and reduce mental effectiveness. One recent study showed that memory and attention span improved by 20% after just 1 hour of being in nature. In fact, horticultural therapy, which uses gardening as a therapeutic technique, is now a widely accepted field of rehab for cognitive deficits and has been shown to improve concentration, memory, and attention. Outdoors can also improve our creativity. Did you know that Albert Einstein took a daily walk in the woods on the Princeton campus where he worked? Being outside can relax you and can quiet your mind. Scientists, artists, and writers have all found that the quietness of a garden allows them to look at new things or to come up with new ideas. There's a reason why so many writers and artists have their studios right in the middle of a garden. This is an interesting example of a writing hut used by George Bernard Shaw in his garden. He wrote there. The interesting thing about this is you can actually revolve this thing. It's on a mechanical sort of thing, and it can be revolved so that the sun is hitting that hut all the time. So there are plans for this hut on the internet, should any of you be interested. Now let's talk about mental health and gardening. In 2005, the author Richard Louv introduced what he called nature deficit disorder. Nature deficit disorder is not a medical diagnosis. It describes the human cost of being alienated from the natural world, that is, being outside. Louv describes a variety of behavioral disorders such as attention deficit and depression that he believes are related to this alienation in both children and adults. When I looked at the scientific literature, I found a broad consensus that gardening and being out in nature can improve mental health. A recent analysis of 22 studies show that gardening, which can include everything from building a garden to planting to harvesting, can reduce depression and anxiety. It can also increase perceived quality of life and life satisfaction. Horticultural therapy has been used with groups from youth to elderly adults with mental health issues. This is a slide about the Heroes Garden at Boulder Crest Retreat in Virginia. It's a good example of horticultural therapy. It was built to help veterans as they return from combat and deal with post-traumatic stress. An Army veteran who served in Iraq says the garden and his therapeutic program helped him to reawaken his heart. The garden is full of hope, possibility, and opportunity. I want to tell you a few personal stories related to mental health and gardening. A number of years ago, my younger sister was dying of cancer. It was a difficult time. At the time, I had a moss garden. This is the one I have right now. And there are lots of young plants and weeds that germinate in that moss. I spent hours in that moss garden weeding, pulling out the violets and ground ivy and strawberries. Felt so good. I was able to get into a meditative state that relaxed me and helped me work through my grief. And even though we lived near Route 100 or 400, I imagined that the almost constant road noise was a waterfall. I escaped to the warmth of the sun, the sound of water, and the colors and fragrance in the garden. I found another form of escape besides weeding. When I am angry or upset, what better place than the garden? The physical exercise helps reduce stress, but there is one kind of gardening work that is especially helpful in this situation: pruning. Work through your anger by pruning an ugly shrub, but watch for your partner walking across the yard with pruners. If she or he is in a bad mood, your favorite shrub may be about to change its shape. I've had some personal experience with this. Gardening can also help us respond to acute stress by decreasing the hormone cortisol that plays a role in stress response. And let me describe an acute stress that my husband and I recently faced. Before last September, our woodland garden looked like this. Then along came Hurricane Irma and knocked down at least a dozen large trees. This is just one of several truckloads of trees that were removed. Some of the large oaks were 4 to 5 feet in diameter, perhaps 200 years old. These trees were like old friends to us, and we mourned. Gradually, we began to think of the loss as an opportunity. We now have more sun, and we have planted new trees, dogwoods, redbuds, red maples, that will provide beautiful color next spring and fall. I like to think of what I've learned from a garden as a metaphor for life. Some of these metaphors deal with social or community benefits from gardening and include benefits to the family, to groups, and to communities. Soil in the garden is like our family. My garden ancestors, those who gardened before me on the same land, improved the soil by adding manure and other compost. It's much easier for me to grow plants because of their care of the soil. And if I am a good steward, those who have the land after me will also be successful with their garden. And I will tell you, for those of you who live here locally, my garden ancestors in my current garden were Kitty and Walt Thrillkeld. And I know they put a lot of manure in there, and it's really worked. I want to compare plants in our garden to the children we raise in our families. If you have good garden soil, plants grow large and have lots of blooms. In strong families where parents are warm and supportive, children are more likely to mature into healthy, productive adults. If you have poor garden soil, plants will be leggy and produce fewer vegetables. In unhealthy families where parents are neglectful or abusive, children will not learn to trust others and may be abusive themselves as adults. I've learned that I prefer English-style natural landscapes and cottage gardens. I like lots of different plants, lots of different colors, lots of different textures, all at the same time. I'm less fond of formal gardens. There's an interesting analogy to life here. Think how much more interesting a discussion with this group of people would be. They represent different age groups, different cultures, and different perspectives. They are like my natural garden. Then a conversation with this stiff, formal group. Now, I will say they have flowers on. I want many types of people and plants in my life. Scientific studies of tree roots have some interesting messages for us and about communities. Suzanne Simard and Peter Volobin have pioneered new research into communication and sharing of resources among trees. Trees within forests are connected to each other, not only by their tree roots, but also by invisible networks of soil fungi. Through these mycorrhizal fungi, trees can provide water and resources to other trees, even trees of other species. Trees that live in isolation from other trees actually live shorter lives than those that live in groups. By living in a forest, trees can control extremes of heat and cold, so they can store water, and they generate humidity, and they share nutrients with each other, as well as other resources. Think have the interesting analogy to humans living alone or in communities. Lastly, I want to briefly mention what else? Insects. Scientists in the Netherlands and Germany have been studying the prevalence of insects since the late 1890s. They have found a 75% decline in flying insect populations. In the US, we are experiencing similar declines. Many of you are aware of the significant decline in native honeybees and even lightning bugs in this country. But does it really matter? Absolutely it matters. Insects pollinate the crops we eat. I understand that insects are responsible for 1 out of every 3 bites of food we each take each day. And they're responsible for the flowers we look at. Insects also provide pest control by preying on each other. Insects are crucial to maintaining a healthy and sustainable ecosystem. Think about the metaphor for life here. All life, plants, animals, humans, exist within a giant network, and we need each other. So, this is my final message. Go outside, walk around, soak up the sun, work in the garden, pick some vegetables, or smell the flowers. Share the beauty of nature with others, especially children. Thank you. Any questions?
Some of us were fortunate enough to get onto your property for the Quilts in the Garden event, which was such a highlight for us. Do you anticipate any more public, open access to your property?
Well, it's funny you should mention that because several people have asked me, can I come see your garden when they knew I was doing this? And actually, Lynda and I have been talking about the possibility of doing a joint garden tour and poetry reading. Stay tuned, there's a lot of details to be worked out. We'll probably put it in the paper, so it sounds like that might be popular. Barbara?
There's a sign-up sheet. If you want to be notified when that happens, if you leave your name and email address there in there, you'll find it. We'll get in touch with you when that event gets planned.
And I will tell you, it's not the same as it was the last time we had Quilts in the Garden because we now have all these big trees down, which are gone, but there are a lot of big empty spaces right now. We're working on them. Lynda?
Lynda, when you first moved into the property you're on now, what was the first thing you did outside?
Well, the first thing I did was I decided that I would not do anything. That I was coming up here, and since I was still working and living in Atlanta as well, I thought, okay, I'm going to rest. Well, that lasted about a month. And after that, I'm trying to think I started moving plants around. We were very lucky to live in a property where there were these wonderful gardeners, but there were daffodils in the woods where they would probably no longer bloom because who knows how long they'd been there, and other plants that were clearly in the wrong spot. So now I moved them to what I hope is not the wrong spot again, but that was the first thing I did. And then I just sort of began thinking about where would be the trails I would put in, because we have a lot of woodland. And so we put a lot of woodlands and bridges. So getting the infrastructure in first, the hardscape in first was the next thing. And then I just kept going. I can't stop.
Lynda, how many different types of garden do you have now in your yard or acreage?
Oh my. Well, I mean, since you were there, I guess I probably added a few. Well, I have a fairly good-sized herb garden. I have a good size. We actually pulled up privet till we were sick of it. And thanks to some wonderful high school kids who helped us do that, we pulled up all the privet and we put paths throughout, and we have a bog garden now because there had been an area that was kind of smelly and I couldn't figure out what that could be. Well, we started taking the privet out and discovered 2 springs in there, but they have been clogged. And so when we got rid of that, I'll be darned, we had a bog garden. So we keep that with various water plants. We have a good-sized vegetable garden, which is Ted's mostly. I'm trying to think. I mean, there are gardens all over the place. It's hard to say what gardens I have. It's one big garden. Gordon?
you mentioned nature deficit disorder.
Yeah.
Did you see any research? I heard this about that the young children that have all the peanut allergies and things like that, lack of exposure to soil,
Yeah,
really what's causing that.
Well, there's certainly a strong belief in some science now that seems to suggest that if children were more exposed to soil, that they might have fewer allergies. There's some fairly good science. There's an article that was published, I think, in 2012 in Science, which is a very premier journal that described just that. Now, whether or not it could do away with all peanut allergies, I don't know, but I think there is certainly the view that exposure to soil, because we live in a germ-phobic society, and we also have sort of equated soil and being outdoors with germs, which I don't get, but you know, it's sad that we've done that. In fact, one of the things when I looked at some cartoons I could use for this, I found this thing about children, and it said, it had a bunch of kids on their phones sitting in front of a school, and there was a sign over it saying, being outdoors for today's kids. So they were on the front porch. So that's really what a lot of our kids are exposed to, and not the dirt that I was exposed to, and many of us in this room, I'm guessing.
Did you see the article in Smithsonian this month?
Yes.
About the tree? Wasn't that
It
fabulous?
was fascinating. She
About
actually,
the trees and the interrelation and how they nurture each other.
yeah, in fact, for those of you who are interested, Smithsonian Magazine did have this article on the very thing that I was talking about. There's a book called The Hidden Life of Trees by a German forester that is really worth reading. Anyway, one of the things she says in that article, which I find really interesting, is that everybody agrees the science that these two people, Suzanne Simard and Peter Volleban, have done is outstanding. But Suzanne talks in her stuff about mother trees, and they talk about almost as if they're giving intention to trees. And that's not true. I don't think we should say that trees have intention. I think that there are a lot of chemical messages they give each other. There's a lot yet to be learned, so people may disagree with me on what I'm saying, but that was part of what they were talking about in the Smithsonian. But it's really, get The Hidden Life of Trees and read it. It's so wonderful. One more thing.
Okay, we're new up here, and I love to garden. But so many people say that deer will eat everything you plant. What do? You just work around them, or in conjunction with them?
You know, I don't have a lot of deer on our property, and I'm not exactly sure why. We have some. We have one eating one of my favorite rhododendrons right now. First of all, I think having a dog makes a big difference. It doesn't have to. I know there are certain remedies that people have used with eggs and so on and so forth, but then you typically then have to use it again and again and again each time it rains. So I don't have any good remedies. I wish I did. I really wish I did. And I have to say that I use metal cages around things I don't want them to touch. I really don't. If there's something really precious to you, I will put it next to my house, because they will not come next to my house. Now, I understand some places in Sky Lake they do. I understand they go on people's porches and and there are plants. In fact, if you go to the county extension agent, I believe he should have a list of plants that you can plant that deers dislike. Now, I will say this too. They don't read. Exactly, and that can be a real problem too. I mean, especially if they have a bad winter. They're supposed to not like succulents. They're not supposed to like something with a heavy leaf, like a hellebores. In a bad winter, I've had them eat that, but that's rare. It's rare. So something like that is a better idea to go with. So. Maureen.
The Georgia Native Plant Society on their website has a list of what plants to use for different times of year, or summer plants.
Great, that's a great.
But they also have in that list deer-resistant plants.
Cool,
so,
cool, that's good.
GNPS.org.
That's a great resource, particularly if you're using native plants, which is a great idea.
Okay, one more time.
One more.
Sorry, then. The Master Gardeners are having a bunch of plant sales in the next 3 months. And Headwaters, did I get that right? Yeah, Master Gardeners. April 28th in Clayton, and they're including a bunch of native plants to this area. So if you want to go on the Headwaters Master Gardener website.
That's super. Thank you. Yeah, native plants are the way to go. I have a huge number of native plants. Thank you so much.
We love the wonderful variety of speakers that we seem to get each time. Jim Smoot is going to give us a real change of pace. Jim recently became a happy full-time resident of Sautee, and specifically Sky Lake, after being a part-timer for many years. He's worked in the field of environmental study and problem solving for almost his entire career, and is now retired from NASA, where he served as the head of Earth Science at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Jim, when he's not studying science, he likes hiking, playing pickleball, and woodworking. Jim's talk is entitled Earth Science in the Space Age.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to give you an overview of Earth science in the space age. And when most of you think about Earth science, you probably think of government organizations like the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and several others. But probably NASA doesn't come to mind. But actually, NASA has become quite a global leader in Earth science in the space age. And actually, if you compare budgets, as an example, the part of NASA's budget that goes to Earth science is about twice as big as the entire budget for the U.S. Geological Survey. So in fact, like I say, NASA is quite a large leader globally in that. And here's the NASA mission, and you can see, so drive advances in science, technology, aeronautics, space exploration, and enhance knowledge, education, innovation, economic vitality, and here are the key words here, stewardship of the Earth. That's a part of what NASA's been doing for its almost 60 years now. And essentially the first rocket launch up into space, first thing they did when they got there is basically turned around and looked back down at the Earth. So essentially NASA's been doing Earth science the whole time for almost 60 years. So NASA is uniquely qualified to study the Earth at global and regional scales from their vantage point in space. The image, this image shows circulation patterns in the atmosphere by using smoke, sea salt, and dust in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of different tools that NASA can use to look at how the Earth behaves. And in the next slide, this is the Earth Science Division activities. And you can see they generally fall into 4 categories. The scientific research for new discoveries is basically where the new science information comes from. And then to try to make that not only available to other scientists, but to the practical side of the planet as well, we at NASA develop products and tools that are specifically targeted for application use. And that's what's shown there in the lower left. And the picture I chose to use in that was basically a wildfire. And as an example, from space, NASA, with their instruments, can see wildfires, not just the smoke, but actually with heat sensors, they can see exactly where the fire itself is, and then guide the folks on the ground, basically to respond to those emergencies. That's just one example of the applications that NASA comes out with. Excuse me. On the upper right with flight, that's a huge part of what NASA has to do is plan, design, build, launch, operate, and so forth, these missions from space and from aircraft. And that's, like I say, a huge job in itself to keep that going. And then the lower right there, technology, obviously as we improve our technology, we try to develop more and more specific capabilities for NASA to do their job. The overarching Earth science questions that NASA is trying to answer really fall into these 3. Essentially, how is the global Earth system changing? What causes these changes? And how can this Earth science activity provide benefits back to society? And the image on the left that I'm showing there is essentially, you can see the United States, And what you see, the spiral activity up there in the northeast, is the major winter storm we had hitting that area in early January. So like I say, from the vantage point of space, we can see a lot of what's happening at this scale. Now the image on the right is from the International Space Station, and you can see, let me see if I can point this to you. Yeah, you can see this is Spain, this is Portugal over here, this is the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean. But like I say, you can see, and this is an evening view where you can also see the lights from the cities and so forth. This is Madrid here. So like I say, from the vantage point of space, you can really see quite a bit. Now the focus for Earth science with NASA really falls into these 6 categories: the composition of the atmosphere, the weather, the climate and how it varies and changes, water and energy cycles on the planet, carbon cycle and ecosystems, and the Earth's surface as well as its interior. Now, some of the images I chose to put here were this one on the lower right, and you can see this is a nighttime shot, so you can see in the United States, here's Florida, and you can see the city lights from space. This is from the satellites. And you can see Atlanta right there, the big bright spot there is Atlanta Metro. But what I wanted to show you is we can also see these hurricanes. This was back last hurricane season, which was the end of last summer. And you can see all 3 hurricanes at one time. And at night, we can see these because the moonlight is reflecting off the surface of the clouds, and we can then basically see these images at night. These other ones with the colors are essentially being able to measure the water temperature in the oceans as well as in the Great Lakes. And those are important to be able to measure because those are input into weather forecast models. So we can do a much better job of predicting essentially the behavior of snow up in the Great Lakes. This is early winter time where the temperature of the lakes makes a big difference on the amount of snow they get downwind, basically, of these lakes, and that's called lake effect snows, and you might have heard that in the news and in the weather forecasts and so forth. Okay, here graphically shown is NASA's approximately 40 primary Earth science satellite and International Space Station missions that are currently either operating, being implemented, or being formulated. So like I say, on the order of about 40 that we have currently underway. Now, some of these are partnered with other federal agencies like USGS and NOAA, and then others are co-funded and worked on with other nations. We work on some of these missions with the Japanese, the European Space Agency, and on the International Space Station, we partner that with Russia as an example. So we can share a lot of this activity since we're covering the whole planet anyway. We might as well go ahead and try to find funding from these other sources as well. Okay, and this image here is referred to as the A train, and what I'm showing you here is essentially 6 satellites that are basically in the same orbit following each other relatively closely. So they're essentially circling the Earth, following each other with different instruments so we can see a lot of different characteristics and make different measurements, but pretty much at the same time and about the same location. And this happens constantly. So this is a typical polar orbiting orbit, I should say. And essentially it's passing over the North Pole, down the South Pole, back up to the North Pole. So it's basically going around this way and the Earth is turning inside that. So it's making a pass about every 90 minutes. It does a full orbit, moving at about 17,000 miles an hour, each of these are. And they make about 15 orbits, I believe it is, in a day. So we get global coverage every day with all these instruments. Okay, but in addition to using the International Space Station and satellites, we also have an Air Force, if you will. So we have a lot of airplanes that are specially configured to mount instruments on board and fly those to also get very detailed studies of the planet for different reasons. And some of these planes, many of these are hand-me-downs from other agencies. So as an example, the Global Hawk, which is shown here, and bigger view here, it was an ex-military drone. It's an unmanned aircraft. We have several of those, and we've essentially renovated those and outfitted those to hold instruments, not missiles and so forth. This one here is ER2, high altitude aircraft for observation also. It used to be a U-2, which is a spy plane.
Yeah.
So like I say, we've taken a lot of these aircraft that were retired and we've basically put them to use again. Okay, and using the aircraft, we've been able to run lots of different types of missions to answer specific science questions that weren't going to be able to be fully answered from space using the satellites. Now let me go ahead and share with you some of the different missions on satellites that we have and what kind of measurements are made. So as an example, this one is Calypso, which studies clouds and aerosols. Now aerosols are basically particulates in the atmosphere and the role they play in weather, climate, and air quality. And notice, among other things, in this inset here, you might be able to see they're referring to looking at a volcanic plume. And when volcanoes erupt, there's a lot of ash that's dumped up into the atmosphere. And it's important for us with NASA to be able to monitor that, make predictions of where that ash is going to go, because that essentially is not something you want aircraft to fly through. So essentially then we work closely with the global air traffic control folks to make sure airplanes stay out of the way of this ash, or it would eat up their jet engines and so forth. Okay, the GRACE follow-on mission, it uses two satellites that follow close to each other in the same orbit and are able to measure using gravity pull from below with super accurate measurements. They're able to measure how much water is stored under the ground, in large lakes and rivers, ice sheets and glaciers, and even how much water is in the ocean. So all of those can be measured with this satellite system. The Global Precipitation Measurements, or GPM, measures using its own measurements or own instruments on this particular satellite, but also works constantly with a whole constellation of other satellites that are orbiting as well, and they're measuring and analyzing precipitation globally. The ICESat-2 mission, as the name would suggest, is looking at measuring changes in ice sheets and glaciers, sea ice thickness, and other characteristics of ice across the Earth. And this can even measure the age, using some of those measurements using the age of the ice, so we can see whether it's old ice or new ice that's melting and so forth. OCO2 is a global atmospheric carbon dioxide measuring mission, and it characterizes the sources and the movement and quantifies the variability in carbon dioxide around the planet in the atmosphere. OSTM JASON-2 is a mission that monitors sea surface level. So it uses, from several hundred miles up, it uses radar to measure sea level to within millimeters, which is pretty phenomenal. And it also is a polar orbiter and covers the whole planet every day. So we essentially measure the water level in all the oceans everywhere, every day. The SMAP mission measures the soil moisture in soils in land masses over the whole planet every day also. And this would be very useful for a whole lot of practical reasons. Like I say, it is also useful to put into climate models and also weather models and things of that nature, but it's also useful on a practical basis for agriculture, basically guide them on what the moisture conditions are, to also give us a clue as to what the risk is of forest fires and things of that nature. So like I say, this is a mission that does this globally every day. The Tsunami NPP is one of the newest and most capable satellites. It has 5 separate advanced instruments on board, and I won't read this to you, but you can see the list of different things it can measure. It's just phenomenal. Things about the surface, the atmosphere. It's also a polar orbiter and also covers the whole planet every day. Okay, now let me change gears a little bit and talk about a couple of programs and projects that we operated at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where I retired from. And one of the programs and a project within that I wanted to talk about was the SEVERE program. And this is probably going to catch some of you by surprise that hadn't thought about using it this way. But the SEVERE program, and SEVERE actually is an acronym that stands for to serve in Spanish. And that's kind of what this is all about, is to serve. And it's a partnered program that we have with the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is within the State Department. And SEVERE then brings space to village. So the whole idea is to bring space-level technology down to people in villages in the developing world and give them tools that they can use to make better environmental decisions and to be more self-sufficient. So the projects include environmental and agricultural monitoring, food security, public health, water resources, natural disaster response, weather prediction, and many other things as well. And SEVERE has done probably more than 100 projects in that program so far in nearly 50 countries around the world. And these are countries, like I say, in the developing part of the world where they don't have the kind of tools that this provides. And one of the projects I want to talk about is in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is a very poor country. It consists of very flat, low elevation land, but also with a very dense population. And the map of Bangladesh on the left shows population density in red over here. And on the right is flood risk in blue. Now, if you overlay the two of those together visually, you can see that there are places where we have a dense population in red occurring where we have high flood risk in blue. And so it's not a surprise that when significant floods come from the major rivers that are draining from India to the north, that can be a problem. And there's not a forecast that hadn't been able to make to give enough notice for these residents to be able to evacuate. So the chronic result is that thousands of people in Bangladesh are often lost in floods every year. And this SEVERE project that we developed used those radar-determined water levels that we got from the JASON-2 satellite, and when it's flying over land, instead of measuring ocean levels, we could measure the levels in the major rivers up in India, then put those into a computerized river modeling system, and then model out 8 days ahead and basically give people in Bangladesh an 8-day warning that floods were coming. And the first year that they put this into place, we trained the folks in Bangladesh to do this themselves. We gave them the tools and showed them how to do it. And 2014 was the first year they put this into place. And that was a bad year. It was an extremely bad flood year. There were about 250,000 homes damaged or destroyed in Bangladesh, but only 7 people were lost because they had the forecast. And now they've expanded that nationwide all across Bangladesh. And there's other nations that are also being considered to offer this package to, essentially. Now, in addition to that, another one I thought I would bring to your attention that was maybe something you never thought of is that we can do archaeological research from space as well. And so NASA has been using satellites and also aircraft to detect archaeological ruins through dense jungle canopy and even under the ground. And one project in Guatemala discovered this Mayan pyramid and hundreds of other ruins in Guatemala from satellites using thermal imagery to reveal what the naked eye could not see. You can see this is the pyramid here, and it's under probably 4 feet of soil that's accumulated and then heavy vegetation. So from above, all you saw is trees, but like I say, our sensors were able to determine what was there. Now, if you went inside, which we did through here, we opened it up, there were these murals inside that covered the whole inside of the pyramid. And these, from carbon dated back to about 100 BC when these were painted. And the murals were of Mayan gods, and essentially the entire story of creation, according to Mayan beliefs, were painted on the inside of this pyramid. And so it really helped advance the understanding of Mayan culture and history and so forth. And I think that's all I have to show you. Any questions that you might have? Yes.
You talk about a lot of data that's generated. How does NASA integrate this between all of the different agencies and countries and that sort of thing?
Well, everything that NASA collects in earth science, all the data that NASA collects is basically put in a usable format and then put out on the web and distributed. And we have workshops to teach people how to download it and how to use it and input it into their models or whatever they want. And it's all available for free to everybody. Now, when I say that, it's in the public domain, the data is. The technology that was used to collect that data, no. Yeah, that's not shared. That's basically held, closed. So that's held, secret. We don't share the technology, but we do share the data. And we share it, like I say, across the world. Since we essentially cover the planet every day with all these sensors, all that information is available. And so the SEVERE program, as an example, is a good example where the developing world that doesn't do this for themselves, and they don't have a U.S. Geological Survey or whatever, they have the same data that now can make weather forecasts for them and so forth, because they don't have a weather forecasting, in their country. And it gives them warnings on when freezes are going to take place, so agriculture can get prepared for freezes and so forth. So all these tools are easy for us to, to put out there. And so, yeah, it's basically, it's a very exciting thing, I guess, to see how much use these things can be put to. Yes.
I understand that NASA can measure and predict sea level, the ocean level.
Mm-hmm.
What is the forecast going forward, say 20, 50 years from now?
Well, I'm personally not buying coastal property at this time, but I think we are, obviously I think there's enough carbon dioxide that's been put into the atmosphere and so forth. There's going to continue. The carbon dioxide that's been put in the atmosphere generally is going to be there for hundreds of thousands of years, so it's not going to go away anytime soon. So it's going to continue to have an impact. So I do think there's going to be a continuing rise in sea level as an example. The rate at which it's going to rise is dependent on exactly which ice melts and so forth. If it's ice already sitting on the water, it's not going to change the level that much. If it's ice sitting on land, it will, and so forth. So there's big error bars on exactly how fast it's going to rise. But I think it's a pretty good guess at this point. It's going to rise. It's just how fast. And so that's a good question. Yes.
Given the current political situation and climate, how is the funding for all of these programs that you just described looking for the immediate future?
Well, that's a good question. Now, fortunately, the way our budgeting process works is, the president puts out, his budget, and then Congress can jump all over it and modify it and chew on it and so forth. So, I guess there's been a lot of give and take because of that. Now, just as an example, when George Bush was in, constantly there were certain programs in NASA he wanted to cut as well, but Congress, wouldn't let that happen, so there needs to be, some compromise, so I'm sure there will be going forward. I guess what I wanted to share with you is the fact that NASA does work in tandem with these other agencies, so there's not overlap really. Like I say, the Weather Service, as an example, works just hand in hand with NASA. NASA does a lot of the research, but the operational side, is still in the hands of the Weather Service. NASA doesn't do operational work. NASA does the research work. And it's just like with that SEVERE program that I mentioned to you. NASA doesn't go help those other countries. NASA, basically develops the science tools, and then it's the U.S. Agency for International Development that does the on-the-ground stuff and puts on the workshops and and so forth. So the agencies are really doing what they do well, but working closely together to do that. Question in the back? Yeah.
Sounds like you have an awful lot of stuff up there. We're not the only people who are putting up satellites. I've seen something, I believe. It's getting a little crowded. I know there's a lot of space there, but.
Well, we monitor what's there. Everything probably, bigger than something your fist size is being tracked, so we're very aware of what is up there. And there are protocols that are followed, so when something is, its time is finished up there, we don't leave the junk up there. Basically there's a protocol to bring that back down, and so forth, so it doesn't clutter, space.
Nothing's bumping into anything else.
That's correct. That's correct. But moving at 17,000 miles an hour or whatever, even something pretty little can cause some damage. But yeah, that's something that is being managed. But there's not as much overlap as you would think. Now, obviously, there is some, maybe some duplication between what we do on the NASA side and what the military does, because obviously they're not going to share their imagery really with anybody. But the NASA imagery, like I say, we fully share that. So we have to be very careful. And we did work with the military on certain things and made it very clear as to what is going to be in the public domain and what wouldn't be in the public domain. We can't, like I say, put our national security at risk, Yes.
What other countries have an equivalent to NASA's data gathering satellites?
Well, there's many countries and organizations of countries, like the European Space Agency is a collection of countries that has a pretty active space program. And NASA works closely with those. Some of the satellites are partnered with them and then co-funded, and even the technology is worked on together. The other countries that readily come to mind are the Japanese. We work closely with the Japanese, and Taiwan as well. Brazil we work with closely. Really just a number of other countries we work with. There's really only a couple that we don't work with very much, and two of them that come to mind are India and China. And they really want to do their own thing and not share anything, And so that's unfortunate, and we're continuing to try to, to get them to open up. It makes more sense to share rather than to duplicate, because like I say, once we put something up there, we're getting global coverage. We might as well not duplicate. And there's really not as much duplication as you'd imagine. I mean, it's like I say, we work closely with all these other agencies, so we don't have duplication.
Your presentation has made me realize how overwhelmingly ignorant I have been of what NASA does. I thought NASA was the space program.
Yeah.
And that concerns me, relating back to her issue about government policy. I don't guess I have a question, but I just want to encourage your process of education for our people, and to encourage your former colleagues to make all of us more aware.
Well, they do, and of course, to help you all pass the word, I did put together a series of web pages and so forth. It's on the handout you'll get next door, so you can go get to this, and lots of imagery and videos. When you walked in and sat down, there were some videos running here. Those were, NASA videos. One of them was covering, I guess Hurricane Matthew from, a year and a half ago, and so forth. And it was showing, at that time, our brand new satellite, the Global Precipitation Measurement Satellite, analyzing that storm and the precipitation in it and so forth. And it's been very exciting for me when I was working there to see the progress that has been made. I mean, just as an example, in hurricanes, our ability to forecast where they're going to go and how they're going to strengthen and so forth, and what areas are going to be at risk, has improved phenomenally, really, just in the last few years from all the research that we're doing. And so it saves a lot of money, basically, on the ground. It saves people from evacuating that don't need to evacuate, and so forth. So it's a very exciting agency to work for, I can tell you. It was just great being around just a phenomenal group of people like that on a daily basis.
To your knowledge, was there any attempt to actually use this data which you collect about hurricanes? You can predict speed and direction and everything. Did they ever try to at least attempted to stop or divert the hurricane? Is it possible?
Well, there's a lot of energy there. Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of energy being, spent in a hurricane. So, the level of energy you'd have to put into the system to make a change is phenomenal, So I don't know that we're going to get to that anytime soon. And the challenge, even if we could do that, would be the liability associated with it. If you diverted it to somewhere else and it hit there, well, there's a lawsuit, and so the lawyers would have a field day with that. So very complex questions, but what we see with more and more stronger hurricanes as sea level, as the water temperature in as upper sea level, upper oceans increases, it's a way to dissipate energy. And so we're going to probably see continued strong storms and so forth as a way to dissipate the energy and move some of that energy from more the equator area farther north and farther south in the southern hemisphere. So it's just another way the planet, tries to smooth things out when we throw more energy into the system. So hurricanes are just a natural part of that, and like I say, as things warm up, I think we're going to see more of this. Okay, one here in the front.
I think that your talk has been wonderfully hopeful in this era of political and cultural upheaval. To know that some of you guys are up there working together. You're in outer space.
Well, yeah, that's right. Well, it's interesting to see how well the scientists do work together. So even though we've had our challenges with Russia, just look at the media any day, but, on the space station, the Russian scientists and the U.S. scientists, they get along great, We have no problem, working together with those folks. But the politicians, maybe we need to take them up on the space station.
Must be the gravity of the situation.
One more question? Okay, right here.
Your project in Guatemala intrigued me because when I was a volunteer in the Chat River National Park, the Park Service has to preserve all the antiquities, the ruins of mills along the river, and also endangered species there.
Right.
So they had a situation where the endangered species Bay starvine was totally encompassing the river ruins that they wanted to take pictures of from space. I don't know who was doing it. I don't know if NASA does things like that for other agencies or not, but somebody was going to be taking these pictures because this way they could preserve the mill ruins intact and yet see what was inside the buildings. But we had to go in and remove, and we had special permission to do this, cut back the Bay starvine, pretend it was privet, and cut it back so that they could get the pictures. And the Park Service people were getting upset because the Bay starvine was growing back and they hadn't done the pictures yet. But it sounds like whatever material, whatever machines you had could see through it.
Well, when I say see through it, there's different technology. Now, what we used in that case, when the Mayans developed their infrastructure, if you will, it was basically limestone. And they would quarry the limestone, build the pyramids and other structures. They would burn the limestone to create lime plasters, and they would plaster the surfaces of the buildings as well as the ground with the plaster. They would slope it so when it rained, all that rain would flow into the reservoirs that were created when they quarried the limestone. And then they would use gravity to flow it out into their agricultural fields for growing food. Wow. And they did all this without a wheel or anything, So it was pretty interesting, the technology that they used. But what happened is I'll tell you a quick story here, but what happened, we think, to the Mayan culture that died out was that they cut down all the trees basically for fuel and to burn the limestone, so they denuded the landscape. That changed the microclimate in the area. It stopped raining. They ran out of water. They couldn't grow their food, so they had to leave. And that's essentially what happened. And then basically the jungle grew up over top of all of this, and all of that lime plaster changed the pH of the soil. And then when the plants grew back, it changed the kind of plants and stressed the plants enough that from space we could see that signature in the vegetation color-wise. So we could see exactly where these areas were, and like I say, hundreds of ruins we could find from space. Now the problem was we knew where they were, but we couldn't publish it because then the looters would go and just clean up. So even that pyramid I showed, that was the one I went in, that had so much information to share. We had to have 24-hour guards on that for 2 years while National Science Foundation and others came in to study it scientifically. And then as soon as it was all studied and they documented everything, then they cemented it shut and basically made it impenetrable again, to save it. So the looters couldn't go in there and destroy it. So, yeah, just another challenge. But there's all these different tools that you can use, and like I say, through soil, like there's some of the technology that we're using in Egypt where it's not vegetation, it's sand, but the nature of how during the day the ground heats and cools changes whether it's sand or whether there's rock below the surface. So we could see those signatures from space also and see ruins under the sand effectively. So there's lots of different tools that with remote sensing you can use in archaeology, and now it's a whole new field called space archaeology.
Would it have been NASA that did that for the Park Service, do you know? Or
It could have been, but there's probably other avenues as well. I think we're out of time. Thank you.
I think the only complaint this time is that the speakers and their subjects are too interesting, and so the questions could really go on forever, but we're aware that people have been sitting a long time, so we'll wind it up. But quickly, we like to recognize our former SNED speakers in attendance, and I'll tell you the ones that I know are here, and Ann and Henry Tipton are here. Let's see, Lynda Crittenden is here. And Julie Winslet, I heard, is here. Yeah. Julie? Where's Julie?
She had to leave for just a
Oh, okay. Have I missed anybody? Okay, well, thanks. And let's see, just two other quick announcements. If you are interested in becoming a SNED speaker, please talk to one of the committee members when we're having refreshments or whatever. And also, I've been asked to announce that Jane Threlkeld has tickets for the what's it called? Empty Bowls. For the Empty Bowls luncheon. So be sure and see. There's Jane right there. So thank you all again, and thank you again to our wonderful speakers.